The essence of myths and psyche. Myths and psyche is not a channel about mythology in the common sense of the word. Here, myths are not treated as ancient tales, folklore, or cultural entertainment. They are seen as living maps of the human psyche, symbolic languages created to express what reason could never directly explain. This is not a space for romanticized narratives about gods and heroes, but for understanding how these figures continue to operate silently within the mind and soul of every human being. At a myths and psyche, myth is not fantasy. Myth is structure. It is code. It is an ancestral way of organizing what we now call the unconscious drive, archetype, shadow, desire, trauma, and transformation. Long before psychology existed as a science, human beings already knew that within them resided forces that did not obey logic. To dialogue with these forces, they created images, gods, stories, and symbols. Myth was born as an attempt to give a face to the invisible. Here, we do not use mythology to escape reality. We use mythology to enter it more deeply. Every narrative, every god, every archetype is treated as a reflection of the internal dynamics of the psyche. Nothing is literal. Everything is symbolic. And in this channel, the symbol is not decorative. It is a tool for accessing the deepest layers of the self. Hence, myths and psyche is grounded in the principle that the human soul does not transform through arguments, but through images. It does not reorganize itself through rational explanations, but through symbolic experiences. The language of consciousness is logic. The language of the psyche is symbol. And this channel exists to translate that forgotten tongue. Here, myth, psychology, philosophy, and science are not opposites. They are different expressions of the same human endeavor. To understand the origin of the inner movements that govern us without asking permission from consciousness. What we now call the unconscious information field, psychic patterns or archetypal structures was, in the past, called gods, not because they were external entities, but because they were forces greater than human will. This channel does not offer ready-made answers. It does not offer easy comfort. It offers understanding. And understanding often does not soothe, it transforms. At Myths and Psyche, love is not romanticized, suffering is not moralized, and the psyche is not reduced to formulas. Here, every theme is treated as a portal inward. We do not speak myths to admire the past. We speak of them because they are still happening now. The essence of myths and psyche. Myths and psyche is not a channel about mythology in the common sense of the word. Here, myths are not treated as ancient tales, folklore, or cultural entertainment. They are seen as living maps of the human psyche, symbolic languages created to express what reason could never directly explain. This is not a space for romanticized narratives about gods and heroes, but for understanding how these figures continue to operate silently within the mind and soul of every human being. At a myths and psyche, myth is not fantasy. Myth is structure. It is code. It is an ancestral way of organizing what we now call the unconscious drive, archetype, shadow, desire, trauma, and transformation. Long before psychology existed as a science, human beings already knew that within them resided forces that did not obey logic. To dialogue with these forces, they created images, gods, stories, and symbols. Myth was born as an attempt to give a face to the invisible. Here, we do not use mythology to escape reality. We use mythology to enter it more deeply. Every narrative, every god, every archetype is treated as a reflection of the internal dynamics of the psyche. nothing is literal. Everything is symbolic. And in this channel, the symbol is not decorative. It is a tool for accessing the deepest layers of the self. Hans Myths and Psyche is grounded in the principle that the human soul does not transform through arguments, but through images. It does not reorganize itself through rational explanations, but through symbolic experiences. The language of consciousness is logic. The language of the psyche is symbol. And this channel exists to translate that forgotten tongue. Here, myth, psychology, philosophy, and science are not opposites. They are different expressions of the same human endeavor to understand the origin of the inner movements that govern us without asking permission from consciousness. What we now call the unconscious information field, psychic patterns or archetypal structures was, in the past, called gods, not because they were external entities, but because they were forces greater than human will. This channel does not offer ready-made answers. It does not offer easy comfort. It offers understanding, and understanding often does not soothe, it transforms. At Myths and Psyche, love is not romanticized, suffering is not moralized, and the psyche is not reduced to formulas. Here, every theme is treated as a portal inward. We do not myths to admire the past. We speak of them because they are still happening now, in the bonds we form, in the patterns we repeat, in the pains we cannot comprehend, in the attractions that surprise us, in the encounters that disorganize us, in the loves that transform us. Myths and Psyche is a territory of passage, a space where myth is not worship but mirror, where symbol is not belief but language, where psychology is not cold technique but a continuation of the ancient art of interpreting the human soul through stories. This channel does not teach you what to believe, it teaches you how to observe. It does not impose answers, it provokes recognition. It does not promise healing, it offers symbolic awareness. Here, myths do not explain the world, they explain you. There is an idea almost no one questions, the idea that we choose whom we love, that love arises from a decision, a personal preference, or a consciously built affinity. This belief is so strong that it sustains romances, songs, films, and even the way we interpret our own emotional histories. But what if this weren't true? What if love weren't a choice but a summons? What if what we call decision were merely the belated attempt of consciousness to explain something already decided long before at a deeper level of the psyche? At Myths and Psyche, love is not seen as a casual encounter between two free wills. It is seen as an archetypal movement, a force that precedes thought, a dynamic emerging from the unconscious that drags consciousness into experiences it never planned, never asked for, and often doesn't understand. In this sense, love is not comfort, it is rupture, it is not choice, it is psychic destiny. Everyone has lived this, even without knowing how to name it. That encounter that changes everything. That person who arrives without warning and reorganizes your inner structure. That bond that makes no logical sense, yet carries an irresistible magnetic force. That relationship that isn't meant to last, but to transform. These encounters are not mistakes. They are movements of the soul trying to integrate something still incomplete. The problem is that we've been taught to interpret these experiences only through moral or romantic lenses. We say it was bad luck, karma, fate, chemistry, obsession, trauma, fortune, or madness. Rarely do we pause to notice that behind all this lies a symbolic intelligence at work, a logic that is not rational, yet profoundly organized, the logic of the psyche. In this video from How Myths and Psyche, you won't hear a love story. You'll hear a story of transformation, one that reveals why certain people enter our lives not to make us happy, but to make us conscious, not to complete us, but to confront us, not to protect us, but to awaken us. The myth that translates this truth with the greatest precision is not romantic, it is profound, it is dark, it is initiatory. It is the story of Hades and Persephone, a myth about descent into the unconscious, loss of innocence, rupture of the old identity, and the birth of a new consciousness. A myth that reveals that true love is not what pleases the ego, but what reorganizes the soul. Here, you won't find easy comfort. You'll find mirrors. You won't find ready answers. You'll find questions that pierce through. You won't hear about idealized love. You'll hear about love as a rite of passage, because at its core, love is not a romantic event. It is a movement of the psyche, and you do not choose whom you love. Your psyche chooses for you. The illusion of choice in love. From an early age, we learn to tell our own emotional story as if we were absolute authors of our choices. We say we chose whom to love, how to love, and when to love. This narrative upholds the image of a free, conscious, sovereign subject of their desires. It gives us security because it makes us feel in control. But this feeling is largely an ego construction, a rational attempt to organize something that actually originates in far deeper regions of the psyche. Consciousness likes to believe it decides. It needs this belief to maintain its own identity. If it didn't, it would have to admit it's traversed by forces beyond its control. And that is unbearable for the ego. The ego needs authorship. It needs to feel it governs. So when love appears, it rushes to create a narrative. It calls it affinity, choice, personal taste, coincidence, chance. It turns an archetypal event into a personal story. But love rarely begins in consciousness. It begins as a silent movement, an attraction field forming before any justification, a resonance preceding thought. By the time a person finally realizes they're involved, the process has already occurred. Consciousness merely arrives late to explain something already decided in another layer of being. That's why so often we fall for those who don't match our rational criteria, those who don't fit what we claim to want, who disorganize us, who threaten our emotional structures. If choice were truly conscious, love would be predictable, safe, and comfortable. But it almost never is. It is unpredictable, destabilizing, and transformative. That's not a flaw in love, it's its nature. At Myths and Psyche, we understand that what we call choice is, most of the time, a belated rationalization. Love doesn't begin as a decision. It begins as unconscious recognition, as if something within us identified in the other a missing piece, a similar wound, a complementary shadow, or an unlived potential for transformation. The psyche does not seek comfort, it seeks wholeness, and wholeness does not mean immediate harmony, it means integration. It means bringing into consciousness what has been denied, repressed, or forgotten. Love is one of the most direct paths the psyche finds to accomplish this movement. That's why it's so intense. That's why it's so dangerous. That's why it's so necessary. When we say, "I chose you," we're only telling the visible part of the story. What really happened is that something within us was activated, an ancient pattern, an archetype, a symbolic memory, a wound, a desire for integration. Consciousness merely followed a movement already underway. That's why loving often feels like something surpasses us, as if we weren't fully the authors of the experience, as if we were being led. This sensation is not weakness, it is psychic truth. To love is to allow the psyche to take us where consciousness alone would never go. The illusion of choice is comforting. It shields us from the anguish of admitting we're traversed by deep forces, but it also prevents us from understanding love's true meaning. When we believe we choose rationally, we treat love as a product of the ego. When we understand that the psyche chooses, we begin to see love as a process of transformation. At that point, love ceases to be merely a romantic experience and becomes a symbolic event, a rite of internal passage, a call to descent, a summons to face parts of ourselves we haven't yet met. To love is not to find someone who completes us. It is to find someone who reveals us. That's why at Myths and Psyche, love is seen as the language of the unconscious, a way the soul finds to speak to us when reason is no longer enough. It doesn't ask permission, it doesn't negotiate, it doesn't explain. It happens, and only afterward do we try to understand. This is the great inversion that changes everything. We don't love because we choose. We choose because we are already loving. Consciousness arrives afterward. The psyche arrives first. And it is precisely at this point that myth stops being an ancient story and becomes a mirror of what is happening within each of us right now, in this very moment. Hades and Persephone, the descent into the unconscious. Among all mythological stories, few are as misunderstood as that of Hades and Persephone. Over time, it has been reduced to a narrative of abduction, violence, or romantic tragedy. But this reading is superficial. It arises when myth is interpreted literally, as if it were about ordinary people rather than psychic forces. At Myths and Psyche, this story is read as what it truly is. A symbolic map of the soul's transformation process. Persephone is not just a young girl. She represents consciousness still tied to innocence, to the surface of life, to the mother's world, to protection and light. She lives in a state where existence has not yet been pierced by shadow, where the world seems predictable, ordered, safe. Persephone is the soul before rupture. She is the psyche before encountering depth. Hades is not a romantic villain. He is the archetype of the deep unconscious, the realm that holds everything repressed, forgotten, denied, or not yet lived. Hades does not seduce. He calls, he does not convince, he pulls. His role is not to please but to transform, not to comfort but to reorganize. When Persephone is taken to the underworld, we are not witnessing a literal kidnapping. We are witnessing the inevitable moment when the soul is summoned to descend. Every human being at some point in life is called to this descent. It may come through love, loss, crisis, illness, emotional collapse, or an encounter that changes everything. Descent into the underworld is not a choice, it is a psychic necessity. The underworld is the place where the old identity dies, where the image we held of ourselves shatters, where the illusions of psychic childhood cease to function. It is there that the soul begins to become adult, not chronologically, but symbolically. An adult is one who has already descended, who has already gazed upon their own shadow, who has already lost the naivety of believing life is only light. Persephone, upon descending, does not disappear. She transforms. She ceases to be only a daughter and becomes a queen. This is deeply symbolic. The encounter with the unconscious does not destroy the soul, it crowns it. But this coronation demands a prior death, the death of the fragile, dependent, superficial identity. In this myth, Hades is not the enemy, he is the initiator. He represents the force that leads us where we need to go, even though we don't want to go there. He is the attraction that pulls us into darkness so we may become whole. He is the psychic function that dissolves the false so the real can be born. That's why this myth speaks directly to certain relationships. Those that don't begin as promises of happiness, but as disorganization. Those that knock us off balance, strip us of security, and bring us into contact with parts of ourselves we've never touched. These encounters don't necessarily come to last. They come to descend with us. At Myths and Psyche, we understand that there are loves not meant to endure, but to initiate. They are portals, invitations to transformation. Hades appearing in the form of a person, a bond, an experience that compels us to grow. The descent is always painful because it implies losing the former version of oneself, letting go of the image of innocence, abandoning the expectation that love will be only nurturing. At this level, love is confrontation, revelation, rupture. It does not preserve who we were. It builds who we must become. Persephone returns to the surface, but she is never the same again. Part of her remains in the underworld. This is essential. It means that whoever truly descends never returns entirely to their old identity. Something is left behind, something dies, and something new comes into being. This is the myth's true meaning. It is not about violence. It is about psychic maturity, not about punishment. It is about integration, not about submission. It is about inner coronation. Love, when operating at this level, is not a gift. It is an initiatory trial. It takes us to places consciousness alone would never step into. It shows us who we are when the mask falls. It makes us traverse the underworld, not to destroy us, but to make us real. That's why when we say we don't choose whom we love, we're saying something far deeper than it appears. We're saying that certain encounters are orchestrated by the psyche to fulfill a specific function, to lead us inward, to lead us downward, to lead us to truth. Hades and Persephone are not characters from the past. They are movements still occurring. Every time a love breaks us open to remake us, the myth is alive. Every time a relationship causes us to lose our former identity, the descent has happened. Every time we emerge more conscious, more whole, more authentic, Persephone has been crowned within us. And that is precisely why, at Myths and Psyche, this myth is not told as a story. It is presented as a mirror of what deep love truly is, a journey through the underworld of one's own soul. The three forms of unconscious love. If Hades and Persephone represent love as descent, as rupture of the old identity, and as a call into the deep unconscious, other myths reveal different aspects of this same invisible dynamic. Love never manifests in a single form. It expresses itself according to what the psyche needs to integrate. Thus, myths do not repeat, they complement. Each describes a specific movement of the soul. At Myths and Psyche, we understand that there are at least three great symbolic forms of unconscious love: descent, desire, and projection. Hades and Persephone, Eros and Psyche, Paris and Helen are not separate stories. They are distinct expressions of the same principle, love as a force that precedes consciousness. Hades and Persephone speak of the love that pulls us downward into what has been repressed, into shadow, into psychic maturity. Eros and Psyche speak of the love that traverses us before understanding, of desire arising without explanation, of attraction preceding any rational structure. Paris and Helen speak of the love born of projection, the internal image cast onto the other, the illusion mistaken for destiny. Three myths, three movements, one route, the psyche guiding consciousness. In the myth of Eros and Psyche, love does not begin as a choice, it begins as an event. Psyche does not decide to love. She is overtaken by something she cannot comprehend. Eros is not presented as a rational partner. but as an invisible force acting before consciousness. Psyche loves without knowing whom she loves. She surrenders without understanding what moves through her. This is profoundly symbolic. Desire arises before understanding. Attraction precedes clarity. The soul moves before the mind organizes. This myth reveals an uncomfortable truth. We do not control love's birth. We may control our actions afterward, but we do not control the instant we are touched. Desire does not ask permission, it simply arises, and when it does, it has already reorganized the inner field. Consciousness only arrives later, trying to name, shape, and justify what has already occurred. Thus, at Myths and Psyche, Eros is not seen as a romantic god. He is seen as a psychic function, the principle of connection, that which binds, attracts, magnetizes. Psyche, in turn, represents the soul in the process of individuation. The encounter between Eros and Psyche is not an ordinary love story. It is the narrative of the soul being traversed by forces it has not yet understood. First comes desire, then comes conflict. Only then does consciousness arise. This is the pattern. Always has been, always will be. The modern illusion is to believe we understand first, then feel. The myth shows the opposite. We feel first, then try to understand. The psyche moves first. The ego creates meaning afterward. In the myth of Paris and Helen, the dynamic is different. Here, love does not arise as dissent or as a call from the deep unconscious, but as projection. Paris does not love Helen as she is. He loves the image his psyche constructs of her. He is not drawn to the real person, but to the archetype she activates within him. Helen becomes the mirror onto which the unconscious projects its ideal. This is the love born of fantasy, of idealization, of unconscious lack, of seeking outside what is missing within. Paris does not choose Helen rationally. He is possessed by an archetypal image. He becomes servant to an internal representation he fails to recognize as his own. This kind of love is devastating because it does not see the other. It sees only its own projection. The other becomes a screen, a surface for the unconscious, to paint its unresolved desires. That's why this myth ends in war. Every projection, when confronted with reality, generates conflict. Reality can never sustain fantasy for long. Psychologically, this is the love that confuses the other with one's own lack, that turns the partner into savior, redemption, completion. When the projection collapses, resentment, frustration, and destruction arise, not because the other failed, but because they were never truly seen. Hades and Persephone show the love that descends. Eros and Psyche show the love that traverses. Paris and Helen show the love that projects. Three forms of the same phenomenon, three languages of the unconscious, three ways the psyche manifests without asking consciousness for permission, and all confirm the same truth. You do not choose whom you love. You are guided by what you have not yet integrated. Sometimes the psyche needs you to descend. Sometimes it needs you to desire before understanding. Sometimes it needs you to project so you may later awaken. Each myth describes a pedagogy of the soul, a symbolic method of teaching. In these terms, love is not a prize. It is a teacher, not a reward. It is an initiation, not a happy ending. It is a process of revelation. That's why at A Myths and Psyche, we do not speak of love as personal choice, but as psychic movement. Love does not come to satisfy social expectations. It comes to expose internal structures. It is not interested in what you want. It is interested in what you need to integrate. When we grasp this, myths cease to be ancient stories and become maps of our own emotional lives. They show that every romantic encounter is the psyche's attempt to make us more conscious, even when it hurts, even when it destroys, even when it ends. Because at its core, love does not exist to make us happy. It exists to make us whole. Love as psychic destiny. When we begin to observe our love stories through the lens of symbol, something changes radically. What once seemed like chance, mistake, or bad luck start revealing a structure. Certain encounters do not occur to offer stability. They occur to interrupt the automatic course of life. They appear as rupture events, as if the psyche itself declared that our current version is no longer sufficient to continue existing in the same way. That's why some loves don't resemble choice, but destiny. They arrive without asking permission. They disorganize everything that was organized. They shake convictions. They break certainties. They dismantle the image we've built of who we are, not because they are cruel, but because they are necessary. They are encounters carrying a psychic function. They do not exist to last. They exist to operate. At Myths and Psyche, we call this psychic destiny. Not as something mystical nor as fatalism, but as the expression of an internal intelligence seeking integration. The psyche is not random. It moves toward wholeness. When a part of the soul remains denied, repressed, or forgotten, life finds ways to bring it to the surface. Often, that way is love. That's why certain relationships are so intense. They are not merely encounters between two people, they are collisions between two unconscious structures. They are resonance fields where wounds, desires, shadows, and dormant potentials mutually activate. The other does not arrive as complement. They arrive as mirror, as trigger, as portal. It's common in these encounters to feel a paradoxical sensation. At once, something feels deeply familiar, yet dangerously new. There is recognition and threat in the same movement. This happens because the psyche recognizes in the other an element that belongs to it, but has not yet been consciously integrated. In this case, love is not comfort, it is confrontation. When we say love reorganizes the soul, we mean exactly this. It forces internal restructuring. It dissolves fragile identities. It exposes hidden dependencies. It reveals lacks disguised as virtues. It brings to light what was buried beneath layers of social adaptation and self-protection. That's why after certain loves we are no longer the same. Even if the relationship ends, something remains changed. The way we see the world shifts. The way we feel shifts. The way we relate to ourselves shifts. The psyche has fulfilled its function. The encounter has performed its symbolic work. Often the pain does not come from love itself, but from resistance to the transformation it demands. The ego wants continuity. The psyche wants renewal. The ego wants to preserve identity. The psyche wants to expand it. When these two movements clash, suffering arises, not because love is cruel, but because change is inevitable. Myth has always taught this. Every true romantic encounter is also a symbolic death. The old way of seeing oneself dies. The old way of relating dies. The illusion of control dies. And in its place, something more complex, deeper, truer is born. At Myths and Psyche, love is not seen as a promise of continuous happiness, but as a rite of passage. It marks moments when the soul must cross a threshold. Just as in ancient initiations, the initiate did not choose the moment of crossing, they were called. Love works the same way. It summons. That's why certain encounters feel inevitable. Not because they are predestined in a romantic sense, but because they correspond to a psychic necessity. The psyche recognizes in the other the key to unlock an inner door that had remained closed. Consciousness merely follows the movement after it has already begun. When we look back at our stories through this understanding, resentment begins to lose its grip. Not because the pain disappears, but because meaning appears. What seemed like mere loss begins to reveal itself as passage. What seemed like failure begins to show its symbolic value. This does not mean romanticizing suffering. It means understanding it. It means realizing that not every love comes to stay, but every true love comes to teach something essential about who we are. Psychic destiny is not a prison. It is a summons. It does not take away our freedom. It calls us to a deeper freedom, the freedom not to remain prisoners of an incomplete identity. At this level, love is the force that breaks the soul's stagnation. That's why when we say we don't choose whom we love, we're saying we don't choose when the psyche decides to grow. Love is one of the most direct ways life finds to make us cross that growth. It does not come to give us what we want. It comes to give us what we need to become. Love as the path of the soul. There comes a moment when love ceases to be interpreted as an external event and begins to be recognized as an internal movement. At that instant, something essential reorganizes. We no longer seek salvation, wholeness, or validation of worth in the other. We begin to perceive that every romantic encounter was, in truth, a dialogue between consciousness and psyche. A silent, symbolic, profound dialogue that has always been unfolding behind the stories we tell ourselves. Love then ceases to be merely relationship. It becomes language, a language through which the soul tries to communicate with what has not yet been seen, accepted, or integrated. When this happens, the romantic experience rises to an initiatory level. It ceases to be merely emotional and becomes existential. To love becomes to traverse. At Myths and Psyche, love is understood as a path of individuation, not as a romantic ideal, but as a process of becoming whole. Every person we love activates within us a forgotten fragment, a dormant wound, a hidden potential, or an unrecognized shadow. The other does not come to complete us, they come to reveal us. Hades showed us that there are loves that pull us downward into the unconscious, into the loss of innocence, into maturity. Eros showed us that there are loves that traverse us before understanding, arising as impulse, as magnetism, as a force preceding reason. Paris showed us that there are loves born of projection, of fantasy, of the ideal we place on the other because we have not yet recognized it within ourselves. 3 myths, 3 movements, 1 truth. The psyche guides the romantic experience as an instrument of growth. When we grasp this, guilt begins to dissolve. The idea that we made a mistake by loving certain people loses strength. Moral judgment over our own emotional histories gives way to symbolic understanding. This is not about justifying everything. It is about understanding. It is about recognizing that every encounter carried a function, even when it brought pain. Love is not a reward for the virtuous. It is a call for the incomplete, and we are all incomplete as long as parts of us remain unrecognized. That's why love finds us, traverses us, and sometimes breaks us. It operates as a force of soul reorganization. At Myths and Psyche, we say, love is a rite of passage because it marks points of no return. After certain encounters, it is no longer possible to be who we were. Something was seen, something was felt, something was broken, and something was created. The soul took a step toward its own wholeness. This is the true meaning of psychic destiny. It is not that we are condemned to repeat suffering. It is that we are summoned to integrate consciousness. Love appears as the messenger of this summons. It carries within it the promise of expansion, even when accompanied by pain. When we look back, we realize that the most intense loves were not necessarily the happiest, but they were almost always the most transformative. They opened inner spaces, Forced changes redefined values, expanded our perception of who we are. Myth always knew this, that's why it never portrayed love merely as harmony. In myths, love is always dangerous, sacred, disorganizing, and revealing. It is a force of nature, not a social contract. It is a movement of the soul, not a rational agreement. And perhaps this is the greatest liberation that myths and psyche can offer. The liberation from believing that loving is failing when it hurts. The liberation from believing that only happy love is valid. The liberation from thinking that difficult encounters were mistakes along the way. They were not mistakes, they were portals. Portals that led to parts of you that did not yet exist. Portals that opened layers of consciousness. Portals that taught what no logic ever could. Love does not come to guarantee safety. It comes to awaken truth. It does not come to preserve fragile identities. It comes to dissolve and recreate them into something more real. It does not come to confirm the ego. It comes to expand the soul. Because at its core, love was never about the other. It was always about the inner journey the other awakens. And when we say, you do not choose whom you love, we are not denying your freedom. We are revealing something deeper. We are saying that within you exists an intelligence greater than conscious will, an archaic wisdom, a symbolic intelligence, an inner order that guides the soul toward its own wholeness. Love is the language of that order. It speaks when reason falls silent. It calls when consciousness hesitates. It leads when the ego resists. And perhaps that is why, despite all pain, all loss, and all rupture, we keep loving. Because at some deep level, we know that love is the most direct path the soul has to become what it was always destined to be: whole.